Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you joined us today for the next hour when we're going to be talking about the war on federal labor unions. And frankly, I think it's a topic that is not being talked about enough. So we're going to do it for the next hour. Since January of 2025, the Trump administration has moved aggressively against federal employees. You've probably seen all the headlines. Imposing hiring freezes, announcing large-scale layoffs, and shuttering key institutions overnight. And those of us in the federal union sphere, we have quickly become the first line of defense related to these actions in the court and in the court of public opinion. But it didn't take long for the target to shift from the employees to the unions themselves through a series of executive orders. And the administration has moved to undo collective bargaining, rewriting the rules, and stripping away long-standing protections. So today we are going to unpack what do these developments mean for the federal workforce, for the Foreign Service, and even for democracy itself. And it turns out to be very timely because there is a bill moving through Congress right now. We'll talk about it later on, that would restore, if it passed into law, it would restore collective bargaining rights. So it's a pretty timely conversation. I'm Nikki Gamer. I am the Communications and Outreach Director for the American Foreign Service Association. And we are the professional association and the labor union of the U.S. Foreign Service. And before I introduce today's outstanding panelists, I just want to let you know we will have time for Q&A. So if a question comes up to you in the course of this discussion that you want to ask, pop it into that Q&A, and I promise you we will have time for that. And I hope you do have good questions. Again, I think this is such an important conversation. Okay, now on to our panelists. We are joined today by two superstar lawyers who are on the front lines of this fight. We have Sharon Papp, who is AFSA's general counsel and a 33-year veteran, 33 years, 3 decades, working on behalf of the Foreign Service, and I get to work with her every day, Sharon Papp. And we have Thomas Dargon Jr., Deputy General Counsel for the American Federation of, and I hope I said that right, of Government Employees, which is the largest federal labor union that represents nearly 820,000 federal employees across nearly every agency in government, AFGE. It's an incredible organization. And to help us understand the broader historical context, we are so lucky to be joined by Professor Joseph McCartin of Georgetown University. He is a leading scholar of U.S. labor history, and he is the executive director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. Kalmanovitz, right? Kalmanovitz. Kalmanovitz. All right. Thank you to each of you for being here. We are really lucky to have each of you here. We have a lot to cover, but we think it's important to sort of ground this conversation in the history. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of the history, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So the American labor movement has been shaping workers' rights for more than a century, but federal employees were left out of that story for a long time. Until the 1960s, civilian workers in the federal government had almost no bargaining rights. That changed in January of 1962 when President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order that for the first time recognized federal workers as having the right to organize and negotiate over certain working conditions, marking the start of modern federal labor relations. The Foreign Service followed its own path. In 1973, AFSA became the exclusive bargaining representative for Foreign Service employees, evolving from a professional association into a professional association and union. Of course, that history matters because the very rights that were won then are the very ones that are now under attack. So, Professor McCartin, let's start with you. What role have labor unions played in strengthening American democracy? And why did it take so long for federal workers to gain the same rights?
Well, thank you, Nikki, and what a pleasure to be here with you and your members at such an important moment in the history of federal workers. You're absolutely right. The trade union movement in the United States has played a crucial role in making American democracy fulfill its promise and moving the country toward becoming, in the 20th century, a multiracial democracy. However, federal workers were often on the margins of that story. The first federal workers unions were postal unions, and they formed in as early as 1889. The letter carriers formed a union. But when they attempted to approach Congress, and they did this in the aftermath, it should be said, of the Pendleton Act, after civil service was created in 1883, they knew that that system really didn't address such things as their low pay and poor working conditions. And they started to go to Congress in the 1890s and at the turn of the century to ask for, changes and improvements. The administration of Teddy Roosevelt shut that down in 1902 with issuing a gag order that federal workers could not communicate to Congress except with the expressed written consent of their employer. And federal workers were really then, denied some free speech rights at the beginning of the 20th century. That gag order wasn't lifted until 1912 with the Lloyd-La Follette Act. Around the World War I years, agitation began for federal workers forming unions. Beyond the Postal Service, the National Federation of Federal Employees was started in 1917. And I would say that the formation of the AFSA sort of took place in the penumbra of that development, influenced by workers in the early 20th century really believing as federal workers that they deserved more rights. They didn't get them in that era, in part because of public reaction to the Boston police strike of 1919, and the fear that many had that if, government workers were unionized, they might strike. And so when the New Deal came about in the 1930s, great advancements were made in the rights of private sector workers. The Wagner Act, for example, in 1935 gives a vast swath of private workers the right to organize, but federal workers are left out. They're left out of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 as well. It's not until the post-World War II years that the question reemerges again, and it does that in the context of the Cold War. The U.S. was promoting unionism in the countries we had fought, like Germany and Japan and reconstructed Europe, including unions of government workers. And the question became, why don't American government workers have union rights? A movement began to emerge in the 1950s to try to address that. And when John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960, he made it a priority to deal with it. He issued an executive order that you've alluded to, which for the first time extended collective bargaining rights to federal workers with clear limitations. Federal workers did not have a right to bargain over their pay and benefits. They did not have a right to strike. Those things were always part of that system. So between the Kennedy order in 62 and 1981, a new system took shape. Nixon followed the Kennedy order in 1969, actually improving upon it in some ways. And then Congress, by 1978, put the executive order framework into law with the Civil Service Reform Act. I would say that period of the forward movement of federal workers sort of stopped with 1981 air traffic controller strike. Federal workers, as I said, did not have a right to strike. I've written a long book about this. I won't get into the great detail about it now, but in part it was the limitations on bargaining that existed in the 1970s going into 1981 that led to an overflow of frustration among air traffic controllers. We've seen recently just how crucial they are in the system. They got so frustrated in 1981 that more than 11,000 of them walked out, despite the illegality of that act, believing that they really needed to get significant changes. I'm sure everybody knows they were fired for that act and permanently replaced. And that sort of set in place the last part of the framework. So the Kennedy order opened the door. The Patco strike sort of indicated the limitations of what could happen for federal workers. And then I would say since 81, there was a period of great stability in federal labor relations that really didn't begin to break down until the first Trump administration, where there were real efforts to roll back union rights and prerogatives on the job. Um, but if we thought that that was disruptive, what we've recently witnessed in this current iteration of that administration is far more destructive. And it's absolutely right to call it a war on unions in the federal service and to recognize that the rollback that's underway right now, that's being driven, is a rollback of history. It's a rollback to what things used to be at the dawn of the 20th century, and to understand it for just how radical it is.
That is really important setup to us turning now to what is happening. And relatedly, and by the way, I was surprised that there were federal unions. I didn't, until I got this job, I didn't even realize federal employees could unionize. So again, why we're talking about this. Sharon, I want to turn to you and set up for everyone on this event. What did the relationship look like before January between union AFSA and the federal government, some of the agencies that we worked with, because it wasn't as adversarial. It was more of a partnership in trying to get government to function more fairly and predictably. So what did that look like for AFSA?
Right, you're absolutely right, Nikki. In the before times, we had a very good relationship with our management counterparts, especially at the State Department, where we would meet every other week with the head of personnel and his or her staff to discuss just a huge variety of issues, even issues that weren't negotiable. They would sit down and talk to us about. For example, if they were going to change the way that they were going to administer the foreign service test or the oral exam, even though AFSA doesn't have the right to represent applicants, they would listen to us, hear what we had to say, brief us on their plans. They would send us their regulations, which are called the Foreign Affairs Manuals. That's where they're published. For our input. And again, even if the topic was not negotiable, they felt like our input, since we represented, 80% of the foreign service, was very valuable and made a better product. An example of success would be when they were having to staff up hundreds and hundreds of jobs in Iraq. We spoke to them about, hey, let's use carrots, not sticks, to get people to go there. The worst thing would be to force assign people to a war zone. So let's talk about giving them extra R&Rs. Let's talk about giving them priority in their follow-on assignments, those type of things. And the department agreed to that. So we did have a very good relationship, and I think it was a win-win for both sides.
And that example is so important, not sending people into a conflict zone who don't want to be there, right? And figuring out how to make that more amenable for both the workers and for the work.
Yes, and the Foreign Service, they know when they sign up, they will serve wherever they're assigned. But there are periods of time in people's lives where, there's some family situations, medical situations going on where maybe they can't serve there at that moment. So, having these carrots where people who want to serve and, they're getting extra benefits from serving there was very helpful.
Yeah. I now I want to thank you. I want to go to Thomas. You are part of the largest federal union in the entire country, and so I think it's really important to hear what was the relationship like for AFGE and I'll call them the before times. Like, what did that look like?
Sure. Thanks, Nikki. Thanks for having me today. I also call them the before times, so I'm glad we've all coined that term. Really impressed to hear how well things were going for AFSA with the Foreign Service. I can't say we had the same experience in the civil service, so it varies some between agencies, but you're talking about at the VA, we have physicians who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and then housekeepers who are making $15 an hour. they're all covered by the same contracts. And so the working conditions and pay can be different within the bargaining units. And then between agencies, the relationships are a lot different. So at VA, where I do most of my work, we had task force and working groups who would sit down and talk about changes to performance standards or classification standards before they got implemented. So if VA wanted to provide some more upward mobility for a particular job and talk about how an employee could get a bit further in their career, they'd sit down and talk to us about that. But we were not necessarily getting pre-implementation opportunities to weigh in on things that were not negotiable. I'd say, agencies like VA were doing what they were supposed to do under the law, not really going above and beyond. The pendulum, it swung pretty heavily from the first Trump administration into the Biden administration and now back. So a lot of what we've been doing is just, trying to repair during the Biden administration what we lost in the first Trump years. But then we have agencies like TSA. They're under a separate scheme, so they don't have full collective bargaining rights like employees at VA and DOD and elsewhere. So they've been fighting for decades to try to get those collective bargaining rights, and things did improve a lot under the Biden administration. They had their first real collective bargaining agreement signed and ratified. That's since been terminated by the Trump administration and then reinstated because of a lawsuit that we filed. And then you've got agencies like in law enforcement positions, so the Bureau of Prisons, for example, where the jobs are fewer, the types of jobs are fewer. So you have employees who are working alongside one another in a handful of jobs. They had more cooperative relationships with management. At agencies like that, the managers tend to be folks who moved up the chain from the bargaining unit. And so those relationships are built over years and decades. So things were working in the civil service under the Biden administration. Doesn't sound like it was as great as what AFSA had going. But, all of that changed in January.
Sure. And if I heard correctly, the first Trump administration was so bad that it took like 4 years to sort of dig out for AFGE to even get to normal.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I spent probably most of 2020 and 2021 and the first half of 2022 just trying to fix the things that had happened in the first Trump administration. We had a lot of grievances and arbitrations and cases we had filed over what happened from 2017 up until 2021, and it took years to try to remedy that. So it wasn't until really the end of the Biden administration, 23, 24, where things started to look more like normal, and here we are again.
Yeah. Whiplash. We coined that the word of the year, whiplash. And what can that do when you're working in an environment like that? That's a whole nother conversation. But Professor McCartin, as you listen to Thomas and Sharon talk about the relationship between the unions and the federal agencies, like what comes up for you? Is that how it's supposed to work? And how does that help democracy?
That's exactly how it's supposed to work. And I'm reminded listening to both of them of the language that framed John F. Kennedy's executive order and what he intended to have come from recognizing federal unions and giving them, an ability to bring federal workers' voices into agency policies. Let me just, if I could just read a couple of lines from that, just so we are reminded of that vision. That the order began, whereas participation of employees in the formation and implementation of personnel policies affecting them contributes to effective conduct of public business, and whereas the efficient administration of the government and the well-being of employees require that orderly and constructive relationships be maintained between employee organizations and management officials. And whereas subject to law and the paramount requirements of public service, employee management relations within the federal service should be improved by providing employees an opportunity for greater participation in the formation and implementation of policies and procedures affecting the conditions of their employment. And that's how the Kennedy order began. The order was about recognizing that when you give workers a voice in their agencies and a formal way to express that voice, it's going to make things work better. It's going to make government more responsive to the people. It's going to make the democracy work more effectively. And I think the great tragedy of what we're currently witnessing is a tremendous rollback of that, which is a threat to the very function of government itself. There was a reason why these reforms were implemented in the first place. They made government work more effectively. They made all agencies work more effectively. And now we're seeing a complete trashing of a system that we should recognize was built in a bipartisan basis. Kennedy's order, followed by Nixon's order, followed by, federal legislation that was bipartisan in its construction. There was a great belief that recognizing worker voice would make government work well. It worked. The system was put to the test in various ways over time. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration recognized the need to sort of reorganize government, and they had a reinventing government initiative. They worked very closely with unions in advancing that. During the Great Recession, our government was faced with lots of challenges. And again, the existence of labor management partnerships in the federal government really helped get us through that. So we're witnessing a real tragic trashing of a very important, vitally important for our democracy system that was constructed on a bipartisan basis.
Yes, bipartisanship. I think that is a word that is really important to this discussion, because unions, you think, oh, real lefties, right? It's a cause of the left, when in fact it's been historically bipartisan, as you said. Thomas, I want to move to you. When did AFGE start realizing that the ground was shifting under it this year? Like, take us through the first couple months for your union as you faced executive order, or explain the March executive order even.
Sure. So just by contrast, in the first Trump administration, things were relatively status quo for labor relations until about halfway through that term. So middle of 2018 is when the ground started to shift on labor relations in the federal government. By contrast, here, it was almost immediately. So everyone here will remember something called the Department of Government Efficiency. That got stood up immediately and started implementing significant reforms at agencies and departments across the federal government, cutting staff, cutting services, canceling contracts. That has impacts on the working conditions of our members and also the American public who rely on the services that our members provide. So from the beginning, really January 20th, not exaggerating here, the changes started to take shape. Soon after that, we had probationary terminations en masse in the federal government starting in early February. AFG has been pretty busy in the courts filing lawsuits over these things, and we've been partnering with AFSA on many of them and other unions. It's really a team effort here. But we saw tens of thousands of federal employees be summarily fired, being told that their employment was no longer in the public interest. Really horrible. People had exceptional performance reviews, and simply because they took a new job in the last year, their trial period started over and they were let go without any notice. That was in February. We also had massive RIF plans announced in March. So at VA, for example, they wanted to cut the agency from 400,000 to 300,000. The VA is the nation's largest healthcare system, so eliminating 25% of the workforce is obviously going to have a huge impact on the delivery of healthcare and services to veterans. We fought back and filed lawsuits there. And then, as you mentioned, Nikki, there was a big executive order on March 27th that changed collective bargaining as we know it. That impacted us, many other unions across the civil and foreign service. And what it did was invoke an exception in the statute that provides for collective bargaining in the federal government. It's been used historically quite narrowly for national security purposes. So if there is a subdivision of a particular agency engaged in national security work or intelligence as a primary function, and collective bargaining cannot be applied to that subdivision or that agency consistent with national security considerations, they can be removed from coverage under the statute, meaning they can no longer engage in collective bargaining. In the past, that's been used for small military installations or some post 9/11 agencies, also the Secret Service, the CIA. It's never been used to refuse VA housekeepers from engaging in collective bargaining, or social workers, or certainly foreign service officers. We're talking about people who are greeting you when you walk into a Social Security office or a VA hospital. They're not engaged in sensitive national security work, yet the administration used that exception to remove them from the coverage of collective bargaining and the ability to get help from their labor union with issues about pay and discipline, investigations, retirement, leave. There's been a lot going on this year. People have questions, right? What does the fork in the road directive mean? I got this email that my probation's being extended. So by undercutting the unions that represent employees, it's really wreaked havoc on the work lives of those individuals. And since then, it's been really chaotic. I'll be honest with you. The shutdown just ended for now, but there were a ton of rifts that happened during the shutdown. AFGE filed a lawsuit over that. And we've just been hard at work trying to fight back where we can in the courts over these executive orders, getting injunctions where we can, pushing these cases as quickly and as far as we can. But there's not a legal solution to every problem. And so that's why it's really important that we come together, work with other stakeholders, people on Capitol Hill. As you mentioned, there's some legislation pushing through Congress. So it's really an all-out effort to do what we can to protect the civil and foreign service as we know it.
That was a good summary. I mean, it's even thinking back to February and March, so much has happened, and you mentioned a lot of it. Sharon, I want to go to you. AFSA also had its collective bargaining rights stripped by that March executive order that Thomas mentioned. What did that do, like in practice? How did that affect our membership?
Okay, before we go there, I just wanted to point out one thing. AFSA was very lucky during Trump 1 because those executive orders that were taking away official time and office space, they only cited Title V of the U.S. Code, which covers the civil service. AFSA is under Title 22 of the U.S. Code, so they didn't apply to us. And I think that's why in my before times were started with Trump too, because those executive orders didn't apply to us. But we were not so lucky this time, and they definitely cited Title 22. And as a result, we were immediately kicked out of our office space. We were told our collective bargaining agreement at the State Department and Aid were terminated, dues deductions, automatic dues deductions, employees voluntarily sign up to pay union dues. Those were all stopped. The biggest thing is losing the right to engage in collective bargaining, which means that, the agencies can change conditions of employment without notifying the union, without negotiating with the union. And really, we have no authority under the statute to stop that or protest it. And I think one of the worst things that happened was at the State Department, they decided to change at the last minute on the eve of the RIF, the Foreign Affairs Manual regulations governing the procedures for a RIF.
And just a RIF,
and what
reduction.
I'm sorry, a reduction
in everyday parlance, a layoff of employees.
And under the old rules, what they do is under that type of situation, there are procedures that the aim is to keep people who are the best performers. This is for the Foreign Service, who have language capabilities. And then there's always a requirement for veterans preference. And in the Foreign Service, because it's a worldwide service with people moving every 2 or 3 years to a different location, the way they were supposed to compare people was worldwide based upon their grade and what your skill code or cone, which basically means if you're a political officer, you're competing against political officers. If you're a nurse, you're competing against other nurses. Well, instead of doing it that way worldwide, they made it very, very narrow so that people were competing in just one office, office by office by office instead of worldwide, which made the competition area very, very narrow, which meant in a lot of cases, there was nobody anybody was competing with. It was just them. They were the only person identified because there's no one in that competition group. And by doing that, I think we've figured out about 60 to 65% of the Foreign Service employees who were RIF'd at the State Department were in a competition group of one themselves. And by doing that, you're not taking into consideration what the Foreign Service Act says you should be, which is performance and language capabilities and veterans preference. And so that was very damaging, very unfair. But because we're not a union, we're not recognized as a union because of this executive order. We've filed unfair labor practices, we filed grievances, but what's happening, they're all being put on hold because of this executive order and ongoing litigation challenging this executive order. So it's been very damaging. As Thomas was saying, it's kind of total chaos. Regarding these RIF notices, the recent continuing resolution has a procedure that paused these RIF notices, and individuals who were scheduled to be RIF'd have been told, okay, you're back on admin leave, but no further information of how long are they going to be on admin leave? What does this all mean? And it's just total chaos. And AFSA has been reaching out to the department, asking for meetings, and it really would be in their interest if they would meet with us and explain things so that we could help explain to our members, okay, this is what it means, and at least to try to stop some of the chaos.
Yeah, I mean, just our member inbox, they're looking to, so many workers are looking to us to have all the answers when the agencies, should be providing information and they're not. And we had a comment said, and don't forget about the USAID layoffs and the complete dismantling of that entire agency and all of that just incredible, important work that is not now being done.
Absolutely. And we have a lawsuit over that, which we'll probably touch upon, later.
Okay. I just want to ask Professor McCartin, why aren't we seeing more people up in arms that more Americans care? You've called it trashing, it's chaos, that all of these this parts of government are just in chaos. What's going on with the public?
That's a great question. Before I answer that, could I just say one thing about the stripping of union rights on the pretext of national security functions of the president? It should be remembered that the Kennedy order in the middle of the Cold War did not exempt the Department of Defense, did not exempt the State Department. It only exempted the CIA, the FBI, and certain offices within other agencies involved directly in intelligence or security. So that's in the middle of the Cold War. And the idea was that collective bargaining in these other settings, this is not detrimental to security. In fact, it enhances it. So we should remember that. And also just a point about the bipartisan nature of the past as opposed to the present. The Republican Party has changed a lot since the era of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan broke the Patco strike. As we know, he fired those workers. But Ronald Reagan never asserted the kinds of ideas that the current administration asserts regarding collective bargaining. In fact, Reagan believed the very same things about bargaining in the federal service that Kennedy believed. And in fact, he recognized a union of air traffic controllers before he left office. So he never believed that, we needed to get rid of this system. He just believed that you can't strike within the system. I think he handled that particular thing in a draconian manner that was unnecessary, but that's beside the point. Now, to your question, Nikki, of why don't Americans care right now more about this? I think that the sort of brilliance of the Trump people in a way is that it's been a fire hose of things that they've shot out since January 20th. So much has happened and across the board that I think it's been hard for the public to focus. But I do believe that the public hasn't supported, and polls show, the harsh treatment of federal workers. I think sadly, because so few private sector workers in America are now covered by union contracts, only about 6%. A lot of people don't understand, in a personal way, what it means to lose your right to collective bargaining. They've never had it. Now, that illustrates something that, we have to address in this country, because we can't really protect government workers' rights to bargain collectively unless we're also protecting the people beyond government. The failure of our ability to modernize our labor law to do that has left federal workers vulnerable. So I think it's a combination of those things, Nikki, that has led the public not to be necessarily quick to understand what's happened and to oppose it. However, I think as time goes on and agencies like Thomas talks about, the VA, that interact with our veterans, as people start to see the costs of these draconian policy moves, I think public opinion will continue to move in the direction of, we have to, repair a lot of this damage.
Yeah, I mean, just what you described, like 6%, that statistic was unknown to me. 6% of Americans are familiar with or have collective bargaining. So I guess that explains some of it then, if so many just have
sector,
in the private sector. Thomas, I want to move to you and talk about, I guess you could say, good news on the horizon, which is that this week the House bill called the Protect America's Workforce Act moved closer to a vote. And if passed into law, this bill would reverse the March executive order and restore collective bargaining to much of the workforce. What do you think? What do you think are the chances that this bill could pass? And is that something you're pushing for?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something I think all the unions are supporting, and the politics are complex, as everyone knows. It's difficult to build consensus more than ever before these days. So we'll have to see what happens there. But, as I mentioned earlier, there's not necessarily a legal solution to every problem we're facing now. And so we've had to be creative in the court of public opinion and on Capitol Hill in trying to find ways forward to deal with, the attacks we're facing now, one of which is legislative. And so the Protect America's Workforce Act, it's a bipartisan bill in the House. It would essentially nullify the executive order that we've been talking about. That's Executive Order 14251. And then there's a follow-up order on that, although smaller in scope. So it wouldn't allow agencies to use appropriated funds to carry out that executive order, and it would affirm collective bargaining rights that were in effect prior to that executive order. So what we've seen at several agencies that AFGE represents is the termination of collective bargaining rights. So I was on a negotiating team for many years through the first Trump administration and the Biden years over the VA contract, which is the biggest one in the federal government. Took more than 6 years to negotiate. VA just terminated it in August. Same thing we've seen at other agencies. And so this bill, if passed, would restore those collective bargaining rights through their negotiated terms, and it would nullify the executive order by withholding appropriations to carry out those provisions. So we'll see what happens. Very encouraged by the bipartisan support in the House. It's still got a couple steps to go, quite a few steps to go. If everybody watched Schoolhouse Rock as a kid, it takes a little bit more work to make that bill a law, but we're fighting hard there. And I'll just say that support for labor unions, although it's not great in the private sector, a lot of the support has grown in recent years. I think Americans are more supportive of labor unions than they have been at any time in the recent past. You see fights at Starbucks and Amazon, and then, of course, everything in the federal government. The fighting back against this administration, a lot of that work is done by labor unions and employees and dues-paying members who help support those initiatives. So when you see headlines in the Washington Post about RIFs being put on hold and probationary terminations, being thrown out, and battling back against the fork in the road directives and every other weird thing that this administration has come up with since January, that work is championed by labor unions, and the members of those organizations. So support is growing. We want it to get even better as we go on, but doing all we can on Capitol Hill and in the courtrooms to fight back.
Yeah, I mean, I can just talk for our union and about how have these orders affected the unions themselves, because I know AFGE has had layoffs, and not to make it about us, but these organizations, these unions could disappear because of what's happening, right? And I don't think the public understands that. Sharon, talk about our lawsuit. So we're calling it a First Amendment case to challenge this executive order. What is that? What's the status of our lawsuit on that?
Sure. So like many other unions, after these executive orders came out and we lost our collective bargaining rights, we filed lawsuits. And our lawsuit, as with the other unions, is alleging that we lost our rights because it was retaliation for AFSA speaking out against the illegal dismantling of the United States Information Agency and also of the U.S. Global Media Agency, the Voice of America, as it's usually known. We have bargaining units in both of those agencies. And when USAID, which was the first one put on the chopping block, was illegally dismantled, AFSA, along with AFGE and some others, filed a lawsuit. And our Vice President, Randy Chester, spoke out very vociferously against how illegal this was. He was, in the media. And we believe that as a result of this, we were retaliated against by this executive order, and that basically they wanted us to shut up and go away. So one of the claims in our lawsuit is that the executive order is illegal. It violates our First Amendment rights to speak out and to file lawsuits. We're also alleging that the executive order violates the Foreign Service Act, which gave us the right to be a union, and said that unions are in the public interest. And so that's the basis of our lawsuit. Right now, it's we haven't even gotten to the merits yet. The government is filing every kind of motion it can and appealing things. And right now, we're in the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia, along with two other unions. And there's going to be oral argument in December regarding not the merits of the case, but a preliminary injunction related to that case.
And who knows, that could take years, right, to arbitrate. But
and whoever wins or loses, there'll be appeals, and so it will take a long time.
Yeah. Okay, I want to give time for audience questions, and I'm going to welcome on my colleague Naja Ruzika to see if any questions have come in. And so over to you, Naja.
Thanks, Nikki. And thanks for this great conversation. I've definitely learned a lot. And it seems that you guys have covered a lot of ground because we've only gotten a couple of questions in. So as we focus on these two questions, I do encourage those of you in the audience, if you have more questions, please drop them into the Q&A or the chat. Okay, the first question goes as follows. We appreciate the efforts of AFGE, AFGE, and AFSA to fight the layoffs on behalf of affected employees. Are you pursuing any remedies for employees who signed the DRIP 2.0, absent meaningful representation from their local unions, and in the face of State Department reorganization, which eliminated whole offices? And Sharon, I'll start with you for that question.
Currently, no, we're not pursuing any litigation. I'm not aware of people reaching out to us about that particular issue.
Thomas, did you have anything to add?
So the Fork in the Road Directive, which really is a deferred resignation program, we did file a lawsuit over that. There was a temporary restraining order issued early where they extended the deadline to apply for that program while the judge considered the legality of it. Subsequently, that lawsuit was dismissed. AFG has appealed, so that is pending in the First Circuit Court of Appeals. But as the person who asked the question mentioned, there were several iterations of this directive. So it's like 1.0, 2.0 at VA. There was a 3.0 with certain exclusions and rules changing. I can tell you in our organization, we did file grievances over those issues, which are now on hold because of the collective bargaining order that we talked about. So it's agency specific and I think union specific, and will take some time to resolve, at least for our employees.
Yeah, Nadja, I was just reminded we did have at least one person who wrote to us, and under the deferred resignation program, their kind of agreement, they were supposed to be retained until December, and they just received notice that they need to leave in November rather than December. So that is something that we're going to help them with a grievance on. And in the Foreign Service, we can help people with a grievance. They have the right to file a grievance, even if we are not recognized as a union.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question, I think Professor McCartin, I'll direct to you. I'll read the whole thing. So, hi, I'm from Germany and I'm very active in the DGB youth there. It is an umbrella organization of 8 democratic unions in Germany, and they help each other a lot. When I moved to the US, it was surprising that there are no umbrella unions here, even though that might help the organizational power. What prevents these umbrella unions from forming in the US? And what approaches are there actually targeted right now?
Well, thank you for that question. I would say nothing really prevents unions from coming together to form alliances and umbrellas. From the very beginning, when public sector unions started to emerge in the US, there was an effort within the AFL-CIO to create a public sector union department so that the unions that represented public sector workers could convene with each other and work in tandem with each other on mutual points of interest. There is no longer a public sector union department in the AFL-CIO, but my understanding, and my colleagues here might be able to tell more about this, is that from the beginning of the current struggle, federal unions have been meeting and working together with each other, including unions that are in the AFL-CIO, like the AFGE, and unions that are outside the AFL-CIO, like the National Treasury Employees Union, that there's been coordination that's happened in these efforts. The American union movement has always been a sort of fractious movement, especially compared to one like that in Germany. Unions have, fought over jurisdictions. They've been inside or outside of the dominant federations that we've had at different points in time. And so that history is there, but there's also a history of cooperation across these lines, and especially in crises like are currently going on. And maybe Thomas or Sharon can say more about what they've seen regarding that in this one.
Sharon, I'll just jump
Thomas,
in first.
I see that you're ready, rearing to go. Tell us how it's been looking behind the scenes.
Yeah, we've got a lot of friends who are helping us, not only labor unions, but public interest organizations formed with former federal officials, nonprofits. There are a lot of people who are willing to stand up for, the American systems and the agencies and departments that are here to support the American people. And so whether it's labor unions, AFSME, the American Federation of Teachers, any of the federal unions who we're working with, AFSA, several others, we're really engaged around the clock. One thing that's different about this particular administration, they seem to do things at very peculiar times of day. So, it's like Friday nights and Sunday mornings, we're getting together. We've become good friends, working together to share information and try to find solutions to new problems. So within the labor movement, there's a ton of collaboration. We've been working together to form alliances and partnerships, whether it's on litigation or if someone has strong relationships with maybe a certain caucus on Capitol Hill, it's helpful for them to use their resources and connections there. So yeah, doing all we can to work together, both within the labor movement and then with the broader community.
Thank you, Thomas. Sharon, anything else to add?
No, I would just say that collaboration has been so helpful to AFSA. I mean, we're a small union. At our height, we were 18,000 members, and I don't know what we're down to now, 12,000 maybe. And, we have a small team of about 7 lawyers. So we so appreciate the collaboration with AFGE and the other labor unions, and also the fact that Democracy Forward is representing us, in our USA dismantling case. And then there's private law firms that are doing what we call low bono, meaning they're charging a very low rate to represent us in our US AGM dismantling case. And we just so appreciate all of this collaboration and sharing of information. It's really vital.
Okay, one more question for you, Sharon. This is a little more, I guess, niche about the Foreign Service, but the question goes as follows. Will the federal labor cuts as a result of the executive order affect the Foreign Service exam in any sense, especially since the current administration has changed the requirements and contents of the exam as of this November?
Could you read the first part again? Would the Foreign
Sure.
Service labor cuts affect the exam?
Will the federal labor cuts as a result of the executive order, I guess especially the RIFs at the State Department, will that affect the Foreign Service exam in any sense?
I'm not sure how to answer that, but I can say the fact that we're not a union, I alluded to this earlier, even though we didn't have formal negotiating rights on procedures and we don't represent applicants, but in the before times, the department would meet with us and listen to us and share information with us. And we don't know what's going on with the Foreign Service exam. It's so lacking in transparency. There were people on the register who were waiting the register. Once you pass all the written exam and the oral exam, it's extremely competitive to get into the Foreign Service. And you're put on this list that's called the register. And when a position opens up, you're pulled off that list in sort of the order of, for example, if you have language capabilities, you might be higher up on the list. And they just out of nowhere froze that. I think they thought, well, are there DEIA people on this list, or what was the exam somehow not a merit-based exam? Was it favoring people, DEIA people? And they just told everyone you have to retake the exam. Again, total confusion, total lacking in transparency. Because they don't recognize us or respect us, they won't talk to us about this stuff. So it just leads to, again, chaos and really
More
unfairness.
questions, just more questions, right?
More
We don't have a
questions.
seat at the table.
Yeah.
I want to quickly ask, this was a really interesting, has the AFL-CIO or unions like Teamsters or Steelworkers weighed in on any of this? Like, have they joined publicly in any sort of support for federal unions? Thomas, do you know?
Yes, so AFG is affiliated with the AFL-CIO, number of other unions who are on various lawsuits with us, also AFL-CIO affiliates. They're working hand in hand with us, both through the shutdown and on litigation and legislative issues before this. So we're talking to them every day. Every union has their own style and membership and issues that are important to them. So finding consensus wherever we can. But the AFL-CIO has been a great partner, of course. And then, other large unions, of course, have, their own initiatives that they're working on, but trying to find those partnerships wherever we can.
Great. Working together. That's good. We need more of that. Okay. We are going to wrap up here. I just want to say a huge thank you, Professor McCartin, taking time out of your day. Thomas, thank you. I cannot imagine how busy you are, probably reading a million emails as we speak. Sharon, thank you, as always, for just leading AFSA through all of this. And to all of you for taking an hour out of your day to hear about what's happening with federal unions. I want to put a plug out to servicedisrupted.org. You can sign up for our newsletter, which, by the way, is really well written. Naja writes it. It's amazing, and it's written from an insider's perspective about what's going on at the Foreign Service. So you want to read that. Check it out. You can get sign up for it on servicedisrupted.org. And on December 3rd, we are having a report launch event where we are going to, it's a virtual event. We're going to talk about the results of our survey about what the impact of policy decisions have been on the Foreign Service since January. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon, and happy Thanksgiving to all of you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.